So, hi, good evening, everyone. So, welcome to Angular APAC meetup today. So, today I have my friend and my co-host from the other channel, like Angular Sub Asia, like Ankita, to come to here to teach us something about ngDeep. Oh, sorry, the opposite. Not to use ngDeep in Angular app. So I personally don't use it because I'm not very good at CSS. So I rely on Bootstrap and other CSS framework to do the styling. So I never have to resort to that dirty trick. So if someone needs to resort to that, maybe they need to come and listen to this talk and see how Ankita like find a solution to avoid using this like evil pseudo CSS in the CSS file. So the floor is yours, Ankita.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And hello, everyone. Hope everyone's day is going good. Like Connie said, sorry, my throat sometimes. Let's see, am I sharing the right tab? I am. I hope. Yeah, I am. And y'all can still hear me. Okay, perfect. So
Amazing.
it is quite rare that someone doesn't have to use it. So I'm glad, Kani, that you don't have to deal with all of this. But yeah, I'm here to teach you not to learn NGT, but to unlearn it because a lot of us are always using it. And you never know when it might get deprecated. And like, I don't know, but I have a problem using things that are deprecated. So it's just like my OCD gets real bad. So, anyways, I would encourage participation and discussion. Let's make this an interactive session. And what I'm about to present here may or may not work for your team, but it has worked for my team really well. And it's an architectural pattern that aligns with how you can organize your code, your components in the way that you don't have to use NGD. Like Connie said, my name is Ankita. I work for Dell SecureWorks, and I'm also the co-host for Angular Nation South Asia, which happens at the same time, just a different meetup link. And for those of you who don't know NGD, here's a little helpful primer that I've added some definitions on the side. And basically, NGD is about shadow piercing, which what it does is that it it allows the parent component to reach out to the children component and be like, I will tell you how to behave, and this is how you have to behave. So it's like the parent trying to force behavior on children, and how the child behaves is determined by what the parent says. That's how I understand it, and that's how I view it actually, how it gets compiled and how it's happening. But yeah, these are some helpful definitions. And one thing that to understand over here really is that any style that you apply with NGD becomes a global style. So if you don't have it wrapped inside host, it will then get applied to all these CSS selectors that qualify, unless you apply to host and then encapsulation happens. So the other popular approach is that people just turn off the encapsulation, and so your styles become global. And if that solution works for you, that's great. But my team kind of prefer to stick to the default, which is encapsulation, the default encapsulation, which is emulated. Because with view encapsulation, if someone doesn't look at the component, they don't know the styles that they're adding there are really going to be global. So if we're using NGDeep, I would really like to know why do we use it, even though it's deprecated. And the most common answers I've heard so far are because that's the solution they found on Stack Overflow, or it's just how things have been all these years, and they don't know how to change it. So they don't know what else they can do. And another reason I want to highlight this right now is because recently Angular changed deprecated the deprecated selector of using the slash and only using the pseudo selector for NGD. Um, I don't know about y'all, but like I said, if I hear something's deprecated and they're slowly looking at it again, I'm pretty sure they're also somewhere, someone is thinking of deprecating NGDeep and maybe trying to come up with an alternative and a migration script, but maybe you can be ahead of yourselves and be ready. One thing that it calls out is that there is no better solution for now. But maybe there is. Maybe you just need to reorganize your code in a way that you don't have to use it. So that's what we are here to talk about. We're here to talk about the other beautiful thing that Angular offers, which is host context. And it basically requires very simple re-architecting of your app. It's useful to apply styles to your component, uh, irrespective of where it is. You can tell the component how to behave if something changes. So think of it as the child who knows how to behave in front of parents versus uncles versus like him. The child knows how to respond to that. And I feel like sticking the styles in host context makes them closest to their source. And you can see all the variations of that component in a single place. So I really like using it. I think it's quite powerful. And again, I've added some helpful links to help you all understand about host context. Host context are not like host binding or host listener. I forgot host listener for a second, but they are basically CSS properties, but they work really well for Angular components because of the way Angular works. So let's look at the difference again. As the name implies, NGD involves deep parsing, and host context requires the context of host to show you where the host is. Depending on where the host is. In NGD, the parent defines the style of the child component. But if you're using host context, the styles of the child component are defined by itself. So to demonstrate this, I came up with a simple app with some basic requirements, which are that the child component should be styled according to the parent it belongs, which is often the case where we find ourselves using NGD. And you'll see this in a bit, but I had a heading of the list that I'm displaying, and I'm trying to display it. I still haven't fixed my typo. It's fine. Moving on. I'm trying to display it in the column view, but hide it in the row view. And background color should be different based on the view that you select. So basically, the child component should be styled differently based on all of these things. And just to throw in a material component in there, I just made this thing of changing something in the mat card component from Angular material. And this is what it looks like. So as you can see, the background changes And you can see that list of cute dogs. That heading disappears when you toggle between the view. And so the list is actually a separate component, and the cards, the list tree, let me say that again. The toggles are the parent component, and the cards, the collection of cards, is a separate child component, and the styles around it change based on the view that you selected. And so this is what the code looks like, because in the parent component, we have the toggle button. And based on the value of the toggle, we are applying a class to the child component's wrapper container. So if you notice, the toggle value is row container or column container based on what you select. And that's what gets applied to right below there. That's what gets applied as the class inside which the child component is. And the child component is app list, just in case it wasn't clear. So that gives the child component some context around which it is, and that's how it uses host context. And let's look at the child component. So it has the h2, which is hidden or displayed based on row or column. And then it has the smart tab header. And we'll get to the funky costing that I have there in a second. But that's basically helpful in overriding things again without using ngd. And then I have this icon, and that's why I needed a class to stylistically change something about the icon. So yeah, that is the child component. It just has the image and the other things, but basically nothing else going on here. And then the parent SAS file. So the row container and the column container, which get applied to the wrapper for the child component using the group value for the radio buttons. Those, if I were to use ngd, this is how I would use it. You would, for those both classes, you would ngd the child based on the toggle, and you would apply the styles like that you would change the background and the flex direction using ngd inside it. Now, this is what it will look like if you use host context. So inside your child components SAS file, I'm using SAS here because it makes me feel fancy and I love it. But it's regardless of what you use. You could use CSS, but host context and host are again not simple CSS things. So if you use host context, you could define the styles for both the container classes inside the child component styles. So earlier, the ngd was inside the parent component SAS files, and this is inside the child component. And it's basically the host context requires a CSS selector inside it to give it the context. And the child component then knows, okay, this is my parent, and this is how I'm supposed to be like in front of this, or this is the context that I have, and this is how I'm supposed to be different. Yeah, so the background color changes and the flex direction changes and the h2 gets hidden, all of that without ever having to use ngd. Sometimes, especially when you're using Angular material components, you feel like you have to use ngd. And it's generally because you don't have access to the entire HTML, because the Angular material components are encapsulated, that they don't expose the entire HTML markup. And so you can't use host context inside child component files, because child component styles files, because you can override, you can't add the wrapper or you can't give the context, like you can't have how we had a and we had these row container and column container classes, you can't write that CSS inside the child component, which is your Angular material component, which you're using. You can't update material code in your local. So in this screenshot, you'll see how the material components are encapsulated such that the markup that renders on the browser when you use it is different from the template markup that you write. And if you want to change something about so notice how you don't have the mat card header text. So if you want to change something about it, how do you do it? So that's when you feel compelled to use ngdeep. And if you were to use ngdeep, that's how you would do it. You would ngdeep the header text and apply some styles to it. If you were not to use ngdeep, this is where it gets interesting, because material components are pure presentational components. And so let's take a minute to talk about what it means. It means that they would be used everywhere in your app. And if you're using NX or any monorepo, UI-kit components are basically presentational components that they recommend having the simplistic component that you could use in all of your different components, and they just are presentational. They have no business logic or anything. So if you were to create your own UI-kit component that's for your own app, that is similar to using a material component. Like material components are handy UI-kit components that you don't have to write anything except for you just import the module and you just include it in your code and you're good to go. And if you were to build your own app, it's all the design system components, for example, or the presentational components would live in the UI-kit library. And to have a design system for yourself might mean that you're using a mixture of material components or using a mixture and some of your UI-kit components because you don't really like what material provides, or it's not enough. The material components that you're using are not enough. So you end up building your own UI-kit components. And that becomes your design system. And all of that is fine, but that's basically the point that I'm trying to make is all of those combined make the presentational components that you have created for your app. And it's helpful to have a design system because it's helpful to then, it enables you to provide a consistent UX experience. Oh, so as we were building on our design system, what we realized that what worked best for us was creating few variations of the material component stylistically, because again, Angular material components are so powerful, and why wouldn't you leverage the thousands of hours that Google's designers have spent designing them with all the UX research and study that they do behind developing a component. If you ever look up, this is true story, if you look up to apply as a UX designer, you need a degree in psychology to work with Google for, I'm assuming the material team, but for to design anything in Google, it's not enough to know basic principles of graphic designing. It might be enough, but it's super helpful if you have a degree in psychology because that's how they operate. They spend hours and hours of research and study in trying to build a presentational pattern and understand human psychology in how the presentational components can be best created. Anyway, I took a tangent, but the point that I'm trying to make is it's helpful to have a design system because it creates a unified, consistent UX experience, and the user won't feel fumble about using your app. So as you, so coming back to what we're talking about here, if you create a design system with is a little bit of variation of Angular material component, and but it also has your own stylistically created variations of UI kit or slash presentational components. You use them in the app, and you can then adopt to this. The long name, the CSS name that I have over here, is basically following the BEM naming convention, which is block element modifier. So this is the modifier, this is the element, and this is the block. And Unicorn is basically the name of my design system in this app. And you could have, if you're using it for a parent, the block would be like a section or the parent component name, and the element inside it. So in this case, it's the mat header text. And the modifier is like the variations that I am creating about the mat card header are long text, short text, and things like that. So you could add those, you could add variations and then have this be inside your global CSS. And if it's inside global CSS, you don't have to use NGT because it becomes global to the app. And so this, anything that's global takes precedence in terms of CSS specificity. So you don't have to use NGT, and that's how you avoid it. And surely these are global, and I know adding anything global seems scary, but again, NG-deeping also makes your styles global. So really there's no difference, it's just a different architecture pattern to avoid something that's deprecated. That is me. That is all I have to talk about. I'm out of here, and here's the link for the app. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Or we could also look at the app. I mean, the code that we have at Staglegs. Or not. Yes, 78 shades of blue. Yeah, that's how you get rid of those different shades, because no one knows which shade of blue to use unless you have a defined design system. I think, Funny, you're frozen. No, wait, you're back.
No, I'm listening. I'm just like, because the app I'm working on doesn't have a design system, and
Yeah, no.
we follow the Figma, and then the designer has like use a lot of CSS with a lot of colors. So the app is very colorful, but many blues, many red, many green. So even the button size have 3 or 4 kinds of.
Yeah, I know, which is why it's helpful to have a design system defined, because then you can, even for the new developers who join your team, would know which of these 5,000 shades of blue are they supposed to use when. So yeah, I'm actually also working on that currently at my current workplace. And it's a lot of fun, and it's really helpful. So this is a part So this is the app that I had presented. I can share the Stack, StackBlitz link in the chat if anyone wants to take a look at how the code has been organized so that it doesn't have to use NGD. But that was me. If we want to take further in the code, I would be happy to. But if not, then that also works for me.
So does it mean the project you're working on like has no NGD?
Yeah, it might have from like the legacy code days, but I'm also actively working on replacing all of that code. So yeah, I haven't come across a use case where I felt like the situation needs an NGD. But yeah, if I don't think there, if you just, it's just about reorganizing your code so that you don't have to use it.
So do you write documents to write document on how to style like Angular components so that
Yeah, we have
this doesn't
designed
happen?
out, so we have a design doc for how presentation component should be, or feature components, which are basically, if you're not using NX, feature components are the components that are allowed to have the are so they would either have the store injected in them in the sense that they would be dispatching an action, or they would have selectors in it and all of that. And presentation components would max have input output variables and things like that. So what was I saying? Yeah, so we have design docs around presentation components and featured components, and that's what uh, the developers are supposed to refer to and have. That allows them to have guidelines when they're creating a component about how to, what should, the do's and don'ts of creating a component, basically. So in that, we also mention, yeah, I know documentation is painful, but it's super helpful. If our team has been expanding quite a lot, uh, that's how we've been able to maintain any sanity by having design docs. And those design docs are just like, okay, you onboarded, just go through this and know you what to do. And if you have any questions, we are here. But it helps bringing the new people up to speed really cool and quickly. And sometimes I also find myself going back like, wait, how do we do this thing? Like if I haven't created something for a very long time, I'm like, wait, how do we do that? So I can just go back and look at it. So it's helpful.
But what if your application has a different theme? Then would it be
Oh,
like pink
that,
gold?
what? Say that one more time.
No, I mean, what if your app, like, I don't know, like suddenly the color theme changed from blue to pink, and then would
So
would that
actually,
cause problem? And then you need
no,
to use
because
NGD or other
no,
hack.
because you could use host context to theme your app also. And that's what we actually do. And even on the Angular material, sorry, not Angular material, on Angular's own documentation website where they talk about host context, they mention that you could use host context for theming your application. Because suppose, so at your app level, you would be light theme, and when someone changes to dark theme, you would apply the class dark theme at app root level. And so inside your child components, you can just mention host context dark theme and change the classes in there. So yeah, host context for theming everything. It's super helpful.
Must be hard, right, to have like good like design system and then have every component style like according to the maybe documentations with a large team in an enterprise application.
Yeah, that's what enterprise applications are all about. I see Stephen raised a hand. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So talking of the host context, I don't know. Okay, so I'm guessing it's the BEM CSS style that you are using. But could we use the host context in this case? I mean, where we just put the class that we want to change and then use it right away in our components. Why do we have to use the BEM approach from the global state?
Oh, you definitely don't have to do that. I was just recommending it so that it's clear to the developers what this global class is all about without having to look up its references. Or so, and that's only for if you have class if you are creating new classes in global CSS. If you're using host context, you don't need to follow just for host context. Actually, for anything, you don't need to follow them, or you could prefer your own naming conventions. It is helpful to have consistent naming conventions so that there's an if I've been working on one part of the app and I go check out the code at some other part of the application that I'm not supposed to be working with, it's just consistent, and it's familiar code that even though I have not seen or haven't written, I still know how it works or what it represents. But you don't have to follow it. And even for host context, you just give it the parent selector class name, which could be anything. You could also use the parent components tag and not use a class name and wrap everything inside the host context like that. The host context just needs a CSS selector to identify the context.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
The naming convention can be anything of your preference.
All right. Thanks. Nice presentation, by the way.
Thank you. Okay, so if nobody has any questions, I guess we can end this early. I know, Connie, you're tired, so you don't have to stick around.
No, I'm not tired. I always look tired, but basically I'm fine.
Yeah, get it.
So, does anyone have any question? Or maybe like, how did you come up with this solution? The whole context.
Yeah, because when I was, I don't know what I was researching, but when I realized that you could use, if using host context solves all the things that ngDeep does, I just actually experimented with a couple of use cases and realized because we had started using host context for theming our application. And so I was like, this is similar. If I can use it to override colors based on the parent, then I can also use host context to override other styles. And so after experimenting with it for a few bits, turns out you don't need ngDeep if you have host context.
So, Aline, do you have a question? Sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, okay. I'm just wondering. So, what about libraries? Because for me, I work with our internal UI library, and then we use it across a lot of different projects. But sometimes we find that we need to customize the style. So yeah, we have to end up using ng deep.
So you write the components you said that get.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how I can use host context for that.
So inside, so you're not sure who would be using it?
No, as in, I'm not sure how I can apply the host context for my case.
No, so I'm trying to understand your case. You said that there are some components that get used.
Yeah, and like sometimes there are like some things that we need to modify.
Yeah,
in terms
so
of the styling. Yeah.
So inside the component that you've used, you could specify the CSS selector of where you're using it in the host context.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Like, if you want to modify something about the component based on where it's being used, so just basically, if you're using ngd in the parent component, which is consuming the other component that you've created, instead of using ngdepot inside the parent, you would write host context in the component that is being shared. And for the host context, the selector would be where it's being shared. So the where would be where you were using ngd.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still need to use not important, like with the host context, to change this?
Oh, you don't need to use, no, you don't need to use that. Yeah, that's also like overriding, not important for some to override something, right? But if you use either host context or add something in your global, then you don't need to use that. Yeah.
Okay, Agent do you have a question?
Yeah, so important, right? So if you see that they're using important, then you have to use important, right? So you're forced to use important because there's no other way around it when you're using ng deep.
No, that's what I'm saying. If you add it in host context, you won't have to use it.
If you do host?
If you add something in host context instead of using ngdeep, you won't have to use it. You won't have to then write important. Because then all your styles inside the host context take more, in terms of CSS specificity, they get higher preference. So then you don't need to use important.
All right, thank you.
So this host context is really interesting concept.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend trying it. I use it for a lot of cases. So I would definitely recommend trying it.
Is it like Angular like specific, or it applies to like other frontend frameworks?
Yeah, it's a CSS selector. It's not specific to Angular, but it works well because of how Angular components are created.
Okay, Tito, do you have something to ask Ankita?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if she recommends host content over ngdeep, or it depends on the situation.
Oh, absolutely would recommend it over NGDeep. Not just because NGDeep is deprecated, it's just cleaner code to have. It's just cleaner coding practice to use host context instead.
Thank you.
Appreciate the link for CSS documentation about host context. And if you notice, it also says that it is not supported in Firefox, but that is only because if you use Shadow DOM, that's when it won't work. But it works for Angular components, so you don't have to worry about that. So if you're using host context for Shadow DOM components, that's when it won't work. But it works with the encapsulated Angular components. So you don't have to worry about don't have to worry about Firefox compatibility because it's not a problem.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we're near the top of the hour. So thank you, Ankita, for teaching us not only like Angular but also like a new like CSS pseudo class like host context, so that we can get rid of like ngDiv we can get rid of ngDiv in our Angular application if anyone is still using it. So yeah, I mean, we can explore and try to apply it into Angular like application and see how it goes. Yeah. So thank you. It's great to learn like something new like every day.
Oh yeah, and thank you for having me. Thanking you for taking out the time to listen to me talk.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess we'll see you next Wednesday, right?
Yeah.
And Agent, are you ready for your talk?
I'm getting ready. I don't think I will be as good as Ankita, but I'll try.
You don't have to be modest. All right. Yeah. See you guys next time. Next Wednesday.